What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Gothic Remake, minus bugged achievement at the very least, and another one I'm going to complain about. But before we get there, this remake for Gothic is an interesting beast in the sense that it, I think, really faithfully remakes the original game and captures a lot of what made that game so compelling, and at the same time does have an unfortunate amount of bugs and problems, and some of the changes people's reaction to were generally a little mixed. But first, there are some important things I need to tell you. Normally this is where I would tell you about the 100% thing, but I'm pretty sure most people have figured that out by now. Steam profile is public and linked below. There's video covering everything I go over, linked down below as well. And in this case, I do need to inform you that despite this releasing a ways after the actual game release, that is possible because I received a review key for this game. Not only did I receive a review key for it, but I also got early access to a preview version that was effectively like the first roughly 5 to 10 hours, and that progress carried forward to the full game. Like, I was able to work towards achievements and stuff, and I had access to that all the way back at like the beginning of May. But until the proper review code went out, I could not access the rest of the game. However, I also mentioned a bugged achievement there, so a couple of things I want to talk about here. One that I know is bugged, one that I think is bugged, and then finally an achievement that I think probably needs to be adjusted because while it is possible to get, it's a bit of a nightmare. First off, the bugged achievement, Elemental Show Off. You simply have to deal all of the elemental damage types to a singular enemy. This should be very easy to do, except the achievement does not work. I have tried doing this with scrolls, I have tried doing it with runes, which are like the permanent versions of the scrolls. There is even a weapon you get in the late game that deals all elemental damage in a single attack, and that weapon also does not trigger this. So I do believe Elemental Show Off is well and truly bugged. There is a secondary achievement that I think is bugged, that I also do not have, called Map Sniffer. This is basically to get all of the maps in the game. You do not have the maps by default, you have to find them, and that is how you acquire your in-game map, and it expands as you pick up more and more pieces and, shows you certain objectives here and there. I have found 10 of the supposed 12. The reason I think this is bugged is because I have found 2 duplicate maps that are copies of maps you already have. 10 seems like a nice round number, and that's already more than the original game had. And I admit it is possible that I am just overlooking 2 maps that they added here, but the fact that I found 2 duplicate ones and I can't seem to find these other 2 maps, and there also doesn't seem to be anything that they would be needing to map anyway, leads me to think that Map Sniffer might be bugged. I do not have confirmation that it is. Either way though, Elemental Show Off not working is for sure preventing the 2 completion achievement works, the one for getting all of the achievements, and there's a secondary completion achievement for getting all of the achievements plus the achievement from the prologue demo. And then last but not least, for this particular section, there is an achievement I want to rant a little bit about because it is almost impossible to get, and I think somebody may have miscalculated some math somewhere. And that achievement is called, probably fittingly, Overachiever. Overachiever requires you to learn all of the in-game lessons. This requires you to level up and use the learning points you get from leveling up to learn these lessons. The problem is learning points can also be spent on your attributes, which does not affect this at all, and this achievement is not cumulative, meaning you need to do it in a single playthrough. This means, under normal circumstances, what you would need to do is play through the game a certain way, interact with all the trainers that can teach you the lessons, make optimal choices, and then just make sure that you have enough learning points. However, when I did my initial playthrough and I was looking at the achievements, it is easy enough to find all 46 lessons. That's not the problem. The problem is on the math side of things. I am pretty sure that on normal and hard difficulty, this achievement just cannot be done. The reason being that one of the difficulty options affects how much experience it takes to level up. In order to get this achievement, you need to hit level 44. And not only do you need to hit level 44, you need to hit level 44 without spending a single point on your attributes because you need every bit of those learning points to learn the lessons to grab this achievement in a single playthrough. Now luckily, custom difficulty does allow you to specifically adjust the progression metric of the difficulty, which we'll talk about, and via that you can set that to novice, which will give you the reduced level requirements, which will allow you to level up. But the reason I say this is just, I think, straight up impossible on normal and hard is because even playing with that reduced requirement for level ups on the novice version, there is literally a razor thin amount of experience more than required to hit level 44 that I could find. I'm sure you could maybe squeeze out an extra 1,000 or 2, but to give the exact numbers, in order to hit level 44 with that novice difficulty setting, you need to have 396,000 experience. I managed to finish that with 398,000, and that was with me metagaming the ever-living hell out of this game, with the knowledge of having played the old one and had already run through the game at that point. So while this achievement is technically working, I think it is probably more difficult than it was really intended to be, and on top of that, I really think they should probably change that one in particular to being cumulative, as it requires such an intense amount of metagaming that is only even possible on seemingly a single difficulty setting, as to be a little much, in my opinion. That little rant aside, however, let's get into the rest of this. I do also want to mention here somewhere that there's going to be some light spoilers for this particular video. I know that people are probably playing this game for the first time, given that it is a remake of a very old and clunky game that even just the controls and getting it to run can be a hassle, so I can appreciate not wanting those spoilers, just so you are aware. Otherwise, let's dive fully into this thing. So the main thing I want to get across with this video is that it feels like Gothic, warts and all, as it happens. So for those who are completely unaware, the original Gothic released in 2000, and it didn't really come to the US for quite a bit longer, where it really kind of failed to resonate with a lot of people initially. There's a variety of different reasons for that, but in 2000, the original Gothic was a pretty remarkable game. Like, you gotta realize it beat Morrowind to the market by a couple of years, and it was already trying to do that like open world simulated sandbox stuff, and even does some things Morrowind didn't. And beyond that, it was just a really compelling RPG experience where you go from quite literally zero to hero over the course of the game. Now, I fully admit I got to that game a bit late. I didn't touch it until I think it was like 2022, something like that, so I am hardly claiming to be a die-hard fan, and yet even when I played the original in 2022, I could still tell that I was playing something special, even though you do have to jump through a million hoops to get it to work. And so the prospect of a remake putting that game in front of more people is a really compelling thing, but there's also just a lot of ways that that could go wrong, especially when you do what this remake does, which is add things like new features and change certain things. And yet, I think they managed to draw an overall very fine line between changing stuff to make the game feel better and keeping the spirit of the original. Obviously, not everyone's going to agree with that sentiment, but for the most part, I think this is remarkable, and I hope we see a remake of the sequel. Even if I'm not in love with every single feature they did here, I also think there are problems with bugs we're about to talk about, as well as even the movement still kind of feeling a little unnecessarily stiff, which became more apparent the more I played the title, though even then it is still miles ahead of the original game, as you would probably imagine. But from there, let's dive fully into this, starting with the technical state proper. I do want to acknowledge quickly that this game has a lot more problems on PS5 than anywhere else, it would seem. This is a PC channel, so I'm not really concerned about that personally, but from what I have heard since launch, that version is having the most issues. And yet, on PC, while the game is hardly unplayable, it does, I would say, need a few patches, frankly. In particular, I had a few crashes, which compared to the length of time I was playing the game isn't really that big of a deal. What was much more of an issue were random quest bugs and just problems with the way the world and reactions from NPCs can work sometimes, the occasional quest bugging out for one reason or another, and just like continuity things. And over time, these can be annoying. It does seem like a lot of people had more trouble than I did with this, but that is likely because I have played the original and kind of knew how the quests and things were supposed to go from the get-go. So I was simply working off of a less blind approach, even though they did add plenty of things. Now, in particular, I wanted to call out two very funny kind of bugs that I ran into. One was with joining the Fire Mages. So the Fire Mages are a faction you can join if you join the old camp, but there is a problem with when you are allowed into their little cloister, as that is considered guild territory, and if you go in there, they will attack you for hanging out for too long. The problem is the game doesn't switch to it being fine for you to be in there until you have officially joined the Fire Mages, and that's a problem because in order to join the Fire Mages, you have to be part of a ritual in their cloister, which means you're trying to go in there to join them and they attack you when you do. I found a workaround for this by using a transformation spell to crawl in there as a bug and then pop up in the middle of the ritual and start it so fast before they could trigger their dialogue. So there was a workaround, but it was a little silly. Another issue, it's possible in like chapter 4 for everyone in all of the camps to go hostile right at once, because the game is a little clunky about how it handles a particular story moment, which can result in you not realizing you haven't moved along a sort of path of interactions as far as you will have thought you had. So there was a good little bit there where it seemed like I just no longer had access to vendors because everyone was mad and angry at the main character here, and there was actually a fix for this, and it was just to simply go have a couple of conversations so the game would move along its little bit of progress and I could join up with a faction and everything would be fine. And there's stuff like that where it clearly isn't conveying what you should be doing in the remake quite as well as I think it should. And so there's just a lot of different stuff like that, plenty of things beyond what I've mentioned here. So long story short, the game is hardly unplayable, but it simply needs some patches. I think once it gets a few patches, it will be a fantastic experience overall, but right now the bugs really do drag an otherwise great experience down. Next up, let's talk a little bit about the difficulty. So when I did my initial preview, and I talked about this in my impressions video as well, I was a little hesitant about the added difficulty options. The original Gothic did not have difficulty options. It was simply a set difficulty. And that works well for that game because it was crafting a sort of specific experience based on character knowledge as opposed to your own player skill. In fact, the original Gothic is not a game that really required much player skill of anyone. It's really about your character leveling up, getting stronger, getting better armor, and if you do that enough, you go from being murdered by basically anything that touches you to being almost unkillable. And while there was a little bit of active dodging and things like that in the original Gothic, you could really just ignore all of that if you got your stats sorted out. And as such, it wasn't a difficult game in the sense of the game was, actually difficult to play. It was difficult in the sense that it could be a little harsh and unforgiving until you got that progress, after which you became, again, practically unkillable. And that experience of going from nothing to everything is a big part of it. Now, that is still present in Gothic Remake, but the difficulty options help smooth out the more player skill changes that they have made in this remake, as far as I'm concerned. In particular, this game has a bigger focus on things like blocking, parrying, and effectively countering enemy attacks and things. You couldn't block animal attacks in the original game, but you can do that here, that sort of stuff. And so while it is still primarily a character skill driven experience, there's a bit more player skill in here, and I do think the difficulty options help with that in particular, and for the most part they've done a good job of upholding that main experience, if you will. Otherwise, the game has 3 difficulty options: Novice, Gothic, Hard, as well as a custom option. Custom allows you to adjust the game's individual settings or turn on permadeath. Post-combat flow helper is a setting that will simply allow you to swing your attacks together better. They don't count as combos, but as you learn to use weapons in this game, it functionally changes how your character swings the weapon, meaning it goes faster and can then chain into combos and stuff. This requires you to press alternating buttons at certain moments in your attack chains, which sounds more complicated than it is. And the flow helper allows you to chain those attacks without having to actually alternate the buttons, even if they don't count as combos. So it's relatively simple, but just so you know what that does. Now, our 3 other systems are combat, resources, and progression. Combat is what you would expect. This is the health and damage of the enemies you will be fighting. Resources affects the in-game economy. Normally, as you sell things to vendors, that thing becomes less valuable because they had it, basic supply and demand stuff. As time passes, they will regenerate resources, in this case the currency, the magic ore we're mining, as well as the items that they typically sell. So this difficulty setting just affects how much money they have, how generous prices are, and thus how much money you will wind up having in the end, or at least at the beginning when it matters the most. And then the most important one by far is progression. Progression actively changes how much experience is required for a level up. This affects your things like your health gain, but also how much learning points you get over the course of the game, which is going to affect how much your character can learn and thus master. As I explained in depth at the beginning there's an achievement called Overachiever that is only seemingly possible if you are playing with progression on Novice, because otherwise there is just literally not enough experience to get enough learning points to learn everything in a single playthrough the way that achievement requires, just so you are aware. But overall, I would say for Novice and Gothic, or Easy and Normal basically, what's mainly changing here is how quickly you become overpowered. Even on Novice, you're pretty weak in the beginning, but because you're leveling up faster and learning more that much more quickly, you get overpowered much more quickly. Gothic is closer to the original experience, where it's kind of a steady ramp up until suddenly you're just unkillable towards the end, more or less, even if a couple of enemy types might still pose a challenge here and there. Hard, on the other hand, the game is hard and stays pretty hard all the way through, as opposed to you eventually becoming just a master of the colony as it would happen. Next up, let's talk about the story setup and my thoughts on it. So again, light spoilers here, but the main story hasn't really changed as you would expect. They have added a couple of things and they've altered a couple of things here and there, but by and large the story is of course the same as it has always been. With that in mind, there are some, I would say, modern conveniences that I doubt they wanted to change because it would be changing the game, which is why we don't see things like a character creation, and that is because Gothic sees us playing as a set character, the nameless hero who is thrown into a prison colony known as the Valley of Mines. In this prison colony, they mine magic ore and they trade it with the outside world for the supplies they need to survive. This is because the kingdom at large is in a war with the orcs. In order to fight this war, they need magic ore from the Valley of Mines. In order to facilitate this, the plan was for some mages to set up a magic barrier around the mine and basically force these miners to work. Due to the interference of focus stones in the area that were unbeknownst to the mages and are obviously a crux to the plot of the game, something goes wrong with the spell and the barrier winds up being much larger than intended, and this whole sort of colony sets up underneath it and nobody can leave. Non-living things can move between the barrier, which is how they trade the ore for supplies from the kingdom. However, people cannot get past the barrier. It will just kill you instantly. So that's the situation we find ourselves thrown into, quite literally, when as the nameless hero we are thrown into the prison colony for whatever our crime was. But before that happens, we are accosted by an official from the kingdom who asks us to deliver a letter to the fire mages in the colony. But in order to do that, we have to first get acquainted with the rough and tumble world that is life in the colony. So things are, as you would expect, pretty brutal here. It is a prison colony after all, and it is controlled primarily by 3 different camps: the old camp, the new camp, and the swamp camp, all of which have different ways of doing things, but to be very clear, are all made up of course, convicts. And while they generally try not to literally kill each other, it is definitely a might makes right situation for the most part, and this has led to the ore barons at the top, at least in the old camp, setting up a system of, workers and things at the bottom, and there are just various layers of guards, whereas the new camp is much more freewheeling and dealing, and the swamp camp are getting high on swamp weed and worshipping a being they call the Sleeper. All of which is a pretty interesting situation. But the main story really revolves around you sort of encountering what went wrong here, why the barrier did what it did, and what lies at the heart of the Valley of Mines that caused all of this to begin with. And you're going to do that by slowly investigating these things over the course of the story, and that part hasn't really changed at all. There are some small tweaks, like for instance where you get what is functionally the best armor in the game has changed. They now have given it to Gomez, the leader of the old camp, I would imagine as a way of more directly wrapping up that little bit of a story. So as a bit of light spoilers here, skip this part if you don't want to hear it, I suppose, you will, if you join the old camp, be kicked out of it in chapter 4. And they've made just like a handful of tweaks and stuff around that situation compared to the original. They gave Gomez the ore armor, stuff like that. They also expanded on other things, giving more elaborate quests and the like, where previously they were much smaller. And then other stuff was simply cool to see, like what they did with Zardas, who plays a pretty central role across the entire Gothic trilogy, not just the original game. But broad strokes, I think the story remains as interesting as it ever was, and if anything, it's really cool to see it brought to life with a few more pixels at least. Now, I will say if you've never played this game, the ending can be a little rough. You do have to remember that this game is directly continued in Gothic 2. But it might catch you a little off guard if you are playing it simply for the first time blind. Next up, let's talk a little bit about progression, which I already have a little bit. Primarily, progression comes from leveling up. You get experience from killing things, beating up other people, completing quests, the usual stuff. When you level up, you gain 12 hit points as well as 10 learning points. You can spend these learning points alongside some currency, magic ore, at trainers who will then teach you whatever that thing is. This is really important because at the beginning, even though you can find great weapons, you're terrible at using them until you train up the appropriate skill. There's trained and then master levels for each type. It takes a while to get access to two-handed and crossbow training, but the rest of it is pretty well available towards the beginning, and this is going to allow you to do things like swing a melee weapon into combos and then later on critically hit and do big stagger attacks and finishing moves. And it's really important you do that so you are more effective at using the weapon and don't take all day to actually hit something. Now, this does extend to other bits of training as well beyond just weapons. This is how you will ultimately learn magic if you join the appropriate places. It's also how you get access to learning how to take trophies from animals, which can be useful for gathering up money. And you can even learn some exploration skills like diving to help you hold your breath longer, climbing, and just all sorts of stuff. But another really big aspect of progression is actually your gear, the armor you are wearing. Accessories are also useful here. And to make the most out of weapons, you are, of course, going to need the attribute modifier in order to even equip it to begin with, beyond just your training. Now, the thing about attributes is that they can be increased via potions and accessories and everything as well, so you can actually get them pretty high by not investing any points at all into them. It is just admittedly slower. Now, damage is largely your attribute plus whatever damage from the weapon you're using and what it scales off of. Dexterity for range, strength for melee. Magic does set damage but requires mana, which you can increase, and you have a limited amount of that. Gear can help you adjust all of those. There are permanent potions that can upgrade them, all well and good. But if you want to take less damage, which is extraordinarily important, you need armor. Armor is hard to come by at first. You're going to get the good stuff by joining the camps at first. There is, technically speaking, one good set of armor that you don't need to join a camp for at first, or I would say at least more readily accessible than the others, and that is also one you're probably not going to come across because in order to get to it, you got to go through a really dangerous area. But under normal circumstances, when you're not metagaming, good armor is first going to come from the factions. Now, this is something they've changed a little bit from the original because rather than give you a functional set of armor immediately, what they give you is the base level outfit, and then you can take that outfit to one of the vendors nearby who will upgrade it with specific pieces that both change it visually but also have varying effects on its levels of protection. Now, I have a couple of feelings about this, and for the most part I think it helps smooth the armor progression a little while also customizing armor to your personal tastes. In the original game, depending on exactly what faction you wanted to join, etc., armor progression was very, very linear. There were a couple of, different bits and bobs based on, again, what faction you joined and thus what armor they gave you and what it would protect against the most, but that was about it. Armor was pretty linear otherwise. This armor mod system does, at least through the main portion of the game, keep certain armors more viable for longer by allowing you to adjust them with different types of mods. This means that the armor you get when you first join a faction can be comparable to a armor you get as a follow-up. However, if you've played the original Gothic, you also know that there are some armors that do not come from faction vendors, but rather they are just set bits of armor that you get at certain points. Most of those cannot be upgraded. There is stuff like the best set, or in most situations the best set, the ore armor, which could be upgraded in the original via a little quest. That still exists here, but otherwise those non-faction armors are in fact still pretty baseline. And so what this means is that eventually, despite spending all the money on these mods and stuff to make this armor a little more tailored to what you want, it will get outclassed by stuff you find later in the game. So, at least be aware of that before you start dumping every last bit of your money into a particular set. Last thing I want to mention on progression, I talked a little bit about the permanent potions you could get to upgrade your attributes. I did actually notice that a late game vendor restocks them every couple of days, so you could literally just buy them from a vendor. So if you can get to that point, as long as you've got the money, you can pretty much just endlessly cycle up your attributes as well, which is just yet another reason not to spend too much on them if you don't really want to bother with it, because say you're trying to get overachiever as a result. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and move on to a big chunk of this, which is the gameplay and world section. So this is an interesting blend of the original while also advancing and iterating upon some of the systems that have certainly evolved in the last 26 years or so, while still maintaining both the atmosphere as well as just making it really fun overall to explore. So this is an open world sandbox for all intents and purposes. However, there's a couple of things to know. This game is remaking a very old game, and this means that that sandbox has certain things that will not trigger until you are in the appropriate chapter. The game itself and the story is divided up into 6 chapters. Some things simply will not trigger if you are not in the correct chapter for it to do so. For instance, if you've done all the prerequisites and you can talk to an NPC and they're like, oh, we should go do this thing. Sometimes if you are not in the correct chapter, chapter, that quest or that follow-up will not happen, and no amount of you talking to that NPC or running around is going to change that. So that's something you want to be aware of. The chapter system is important. It affects even things like monster respawns. In fact, it's the primary way monsters respawn. So because this is a sandbox, most of the wildlife you see is set. Once you go through and kill it, it's done. It won't come back until chapters start advancing, and then you will get respawns here and there. There are a couple of quests that are exceptions to this, and it actually is something I want to mention because in my impressions, I talked about how it seemed like some of the monsters were respawning outside of chapter reset. That is because I was doing specific quests. Having explored that a little more, it looks like there are escort quests here and there where certain people will show you to the next camp over. And I noticed that a lot of the monsters that person would help you kill along the trail, when that quest was over, those monsters, or at least some of them, would respawn in their wake. And so you do occasionally get quest-specific respawns and things like that. So that's really important to know. There's also the thing with the economy that I mentioned. There's a bit of supply and demand to what you are selling to vendors. If you sell them a ton of the same thing, it ultimately devalues. But even more important than that, you need to get a map in order to actually find your way around. You do not have a map by default. You'll pick up a basic one in the old camp, the first place you get sent to, and you can pick up several more that give you in-depth looks at individual camps to help you find your way around. That is one of the reasons joining one of the camps is so important. There is the old camp, the new camp, and the swamp camp, as mentioned, and all of them can teach you different things and give you access to different trainers. Speaking of trainers, they have made magic much more readily available this time around. So there is a quest you can do early on in the old camp that will give you access to just a little bit of magic, and it is very strong early on, but you still have to join the mages of either the old camp or the new camp in order to make full use of it. Now, regardless of whether or not you do that, you can always use scrolls of magic, which are one use, but being a proper mage allows you to be trained in the circles of magic, which lets you use runes, which are the permanent versions of those scrolls, which is great. And that's all, of course, to say absolutely nothing about the actual sort of flavor of each one of the camps. The old camp is very like old guard, feudal type system. New camp is much more do what you want as long as you aren't a nuisance to anyone else's freedom. The swamp camp is all about worshipping the sleeper and getting high on weed as they chase visions of this being. And all of that, I think, lends really well to the overall atmosphere of Gothic. You are thrown into this prison colony only to find out that the situation here is much crazier than you probably would have thought between all of these people using ore for different purposes. The swamp camp is less interested in it but still uses it. The new camp is trying to gather up as much magic ore as they can so they can try to blow up the barrier. The old camp is using it for power and supplies from the outside world. And then there's also the fact that the actual world is just outwardly hostile to you, all sorts of crazy, vicious beasts ready to rip your throat out at every corner. Nighttime is truly dark and desolate. Sometimes these heavy storms sweep through the land, and as the lightning cracks through the sky, as you're traveling through the woods at night, it really does just create this immersive feeling that I think is one of the things that makes Gothic as a whole such a wonderful experience, and I'm really, really glad this game manages to capture that. And that's to say nothing of how the remake expands on locations that didn't get as much love, or even some cut content here and there from the original as well. Like, for instance, we see more of the abandoned mine, which is a location in the original, but, wasn't really something you could do much with. Here, there's like a whole little quest associated with it. They've added a couple of quests here and there, and there's just a lot to see and do, even if you've played the game before, which makes playing through it again for this really rewarding as well. And that's before you can start talking about even more of the new stuff, like the ability to get a scavenger mount pretty early on, which will help you run around until you start getting access to runes, which are just teleportation, fast travel, and then climbing and diving. The original had a little bit of underwater content, but not very much. The remake does, I would say, a better job of making being underwater a little more interesting in the parts of it that are here anyway. Obviously, there's only so much water on the map they had to recreate, but they've still done some fun things with it. And using all of that to explore and find hidden stuff is just a really rewarding thing. Almost every time you go, hey, I wonder what's around this bend or up there and how can I get to it, there's something to be done to get it. Like there's a telekinesis spell that will let you grab objects out of reach. There are transformation spells where you can turn into various animals and creatures that you will meet, including a harpy, which just like fully lets you fly across the map, which is how you now access a secret room in Xardas's tower. And the game, if you're willing to put up with those opening hours, eventually gives you so much freedom and a feeling of just having conquered this colony well and truly, and yet there's still more stuff we need to talk about. You may well be wondering, that's all well and great, but can I murder basically everyone? The answer is mostly yes. Some characters are immortal until such a time as they're no longer useful to the story. Some characters are immortal forever. In fact, I talked about metagaming for that one achievement. One of the things I did there was wait until right before the end of the game when I had learned almost everything, basically just needing the 6th circle of magic from Zardos. And at that point, I went around and basically slaughtered every living thing on the map, including everyone occupying the various camps, as you do get experience for killing them. And you'll fail their quest if you do that before the appropriate time, but it's a way in which you can in fact interact with all these people. You can often just fight them, knock them down, and steal all their stuff. A lot of times they'll try to do that to you if you try to steal too much of their things. There's, of course, trespassing and a justice system, and the justice is usually beating you. There is a day-night cycle. You can sleep to pass the time. You can learn how to take trophies from animals and then potentially use that to either get a bunch of money or even turn it into other things via the game's crafting systems, like smithing, alchemy, or inscription, giving yourself spell scrolls. Using alchemy in those parts to then get the permanent stat increasing potions is a thing you can do as well, though that's a little more in the late game. You can also learn how to pickpocket and steal things from people, which can on occasion open up different ways to approach quests. And then last but not least, the much reviled new lockpicking system. This lockpicking system is interesting because I admit at first I was having much the same reaction to it that a lot of other people had, which was that I was not enjoying it. I will say, if you get trained in lockpicking, you can pick up 2 levels of it like much of everything else. It gets dramatically easier because it doesn't reset your progress and it's more tolerant of mistakes. But untrained, this lockpicking is not fun. And I would argue that that's pretty much in line with the way the rest of the game is as well. You are supposed to learn and grow, and if you don't take the time to give your character the skills to lockpick, they're gonna be really bad at it. Now, where I think this runs into a bit of a problem is that it is oftentimes that you will get an especially complicated lock for a container that has almost nothing in it and probably just isn't worth your time, which can lead to a lot of frustration. So while I don't think they need to change the core of the lockpicking system, I think it's interesting and different enough. I would rather not see them abandon it entirely, but I do think they need to do a pass on like how difficult a lock actually is to solve puzzle-wise versus the reward you get for doing so. Because in my mind, the effort versus reward of it just isn't quite there just yet, and you feel that especially hard in the early game. When you can get like a quest or two where they're actively telling you to go get something that you have to pick a lock to get, as an example. But from there, let's talk about combat. Now, combat is a deceptively simple affair. It's really melee, ranged, and magic with a few caveats and subtleties that you may not pick up on necessarily right away. Now, an important thing to understand, however, is that most enemies use melee attacks or ranged attacks on occasion. This means that there are not a ton of enemies who will just straight up use magic against you. That's important because the armor you get from the mage factions in particular, like the robes, tends to protect more against elemental damage than it does regular damage, and most enemies don't deal elemental damage. That's not to say none of them do. There are enemies where those bonuses will certainly be helpful, and being able to swap around armor can, in some situations, be beneficial, but most enemies use melee because it's like monsters and, of course, the bandits and outlaws you'll be fighting, that kind of thing. And so having armor that protects against that is usually the better way to go. Now, at first, if you want to go the pure melee route, you'll start with one-handed. Later on, once you get into the better factions, you can gain access to a two-handed weapon teacher, which will then allow you to use a two-handed weapon in a way that isn't incredibly slow. But even then, you do want to note that most of the time, a one-handed weapon can still swing faster than two-handed, so there are situations where even that can be beneficial. But the aspects of melee that can be a little more player skill are, once you get trained, the ability to do things like properly block at the right time so you can execute a parry and then riposte, when to dodge out of the way, the exact timings of these things, the general attack pattern of the things you are fighting, and there's a decent amount of player skill that goes into the melee combat system, even if it is pretty simple. If you get good at things like parrying in particular, you can fight things that are a bit more out of your reach, even if you probably shouldn't be, because one mistake and you'll likely die. But it is worth learning that stuff, especially especially since we can do things like block animals and whatnot this time around if that is the main route you want to go. Ranged is much more simple. There are bows and crossbows. Crossbows are the ranged version of two-handers that you'll get access to later. In terms of training, being trained with a bow allows you to draw faster, stuff like that, allow you to shoot more arrows more quickly, and there are some enemies in particular that this is just devastating to. They have no real counter for it, especially animals, as you would probably expect, and if you can kill them from range before they get to you, you are golden. In fact, early game, I would say ranged is, as you would probably expect, one of the more safe ways to play. But magic is really where things get interesting, because magic has the usual assortment of elemental blast based on individual element type. So for instance, lightning will potentially paralyze enemies for a little while. Fire damage will do damage over time. Cold damage can freeze an enemy in place for a little while, and when that happens, they are effectively useless. But beyond just the regular assortment of elemental stuff, you also have access to transformations and then some even more niche things. Now, the transformations are interesting. I would say they are most useful in exploration. You can technically fight things in them, but I wouldn't personally. Like, for instance, there are some areas that you can easily enter as a meat bug, which most people will ignore. It's the workaround for that fire mage bug I mentioned. You can turn into a harpy in the late game, which allows you to just straight up fly across the map, which is a ton of fun. But then there's that niche stuff I mentioned. There are a handful of spells that are more focused, like you can put people to sleep if you want to, if you grab those spells. There are spells of Charm Person, which make accomplishing a specific goal a little easier in some cases. You'll get a spell that is basically just for killing the couple of trolls you'll fight in the game, which are otherwise a nightmare. And it simply shrinks them. You'll do that as part of the story, which is really funny. And with them making magic a little more available at the beginning of the game via giving you access to some of the runes, which are permanent versions of the magic you can use as long as you have the mana, as opposed to the single-use scrolls. And it's overall a pretty fun way to play, and that's ignoring environmental interactions like freezing water. But what would any good RPG be without cheese? Well, when it comes to combat in Gothic, I would say the best thing to do really is find creative ways to put that system to use. How are you going to take the things you are able to do and then apply it to a given situation? And better yet, know when not to engage, especially in the early game. Like if you want to go primarily melee and you don't have the stats to kill a big scary monster you shouldn't be fighting, don't run in headlong. But you may well be able to use something like a scroll to exploit an elemental weakness. A lot of enemies in this game have a good bit of trouble getting to you if you are on top of something, so you can gain a little bit of height and then use a bow to shoot them like fish in a barrel. Or you can use the various bits of elemental magic I just mentioned to, of course, stun lock enemies in some way or another. And so, if anything, I would say how much enjoyment out of combat you wind up getting is largely going to come down to how well you are able to creatively apply the things your character has learned in fun and interesting ways to you. Be that mastering the sort of parry and block system of melee, finding ways to eliminate characters from range without ever getting close, or of course just using the power of your magic to deadly effect. But more than anything, your performance in combat is a reflection of your progress as a character more so than player skill even here, even though player skill does play more of a role in this game than it did the original. Moving on a bit, we then have the Steam Deck. So the Steam Deck I would describe as technically playable, but not really that great. And unfortunately, it is a tiny bit deceptive in that manner. So I will say the minimum requirements for Gothic 1 Remake are beyond what the Steam Deck has power-wise. So I wasn't expecting much, but it actually gets off to a solid enough start. You'll have to have all the settings on low, but in the early parts of the game, you'll probably get a decent frame rate. But the further you get into it, the worse it gets, alongside a not insubstantial stutter, especially when you get into the camps where there's more people and things around. And in my experience, the game was just struggling to hit like 20 FPS in most cases. So if you're hoping to play this on the Steam Deck, I would not recommend it personally. I don't think it's going to be your best experience overall. And that then brings us to the positives, negatives, and my thoughts on it. So let's talk about the positives. The overall experience of the original Gothic is here, surprisingly so in some cases, and I will mention that that can certainly include the frustrations people might have had with the original and how unforgiving it can be in places. However, if you're willing to get past that, you can really take this sort of nobody hero to an absolute killing machine that has just truly well and conquered the colony they have found themselves in over the course of the game. And that experience from like literally zero to hero is really compelling, and I think alongside the impeccable atmosphere of the colony and in some ways really the revamped exploration of this original are really the strongest things this game has going for it. It is just a really compelling experience from that standpoint, much in the way that the original game already was. However, as much as I enjoyed that, there are still some negatives. The biggest one by far is simply the bugs. Again, there were some crashes. I had problems with certain quests bugging out. The exact sort of sandboxy elements don't always, I think, work as intended. This can lead to some issues. Other people seem to be having even more problems than I have had since this game launched. And overall, I would simply describe this as a game that realistically needs a few patches to be in its best form. Because obviously, while we don't expect DLC and stuff for a story that is already set in stone, if anything, I think they would be better off remaking the second game in that regard. Before they call it done on this one, I do think they need to patch out some of the worst problems, and I don't want to downplay that by any means. I will also say movement in the game remains a little bit stiff. Like, it's certainly better than the original, to be very clear, but you do often find sometimes movement can be like a little unresponsive. Occasionally your character is just trying to like climb or get up on top of like small little rocks and stuff as well, and you're often traveling through forest and things like that, and especially when you're trying to get some distance between you and the thing chasing you, your character stopping to like carefully get up onto a tiny ledge you didn't realize was something he would try to climb can be frustrating, and the way the game plays around with some of that geometry at times can just be annoying. But to bring all of that to my conclusion here, Gothic 1 Remake is selling for $50 US, and for that price I think you are getting a faithful remake of that original game that captures so much of what made it an original and compelling experience even these days, while also making it much more approachable for a lot of people at the same time. And while I think at a fundamental level that experience simply will not be for everybody, if you are willing to get past that sort of knowledge hurdle at the beginning, I think that the colony sort of unfurls into a wonderfully captivating experience that is well worth people's time. That said, you might want to wait for a few patches for some of the worst of the annoyances to get sorted and dealt with, because once that's done, I think this will be a fantastic experience, just period. So much so that I sincerely hope these guys get a crack at remaking the second game. And if you're unfamiliar, Gothic is actually a trilogy. 2 is considered sort of the highlight, the peak of the series. Gothic 3 is a weird game that honestly is hard to explain in a short way, but I would love to see these guys remake 2. And overall, this is mostly just an awesome time, which is where we are going to leave this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.